For the virtual audience, if you could post your comments in the comments box. We've got 2 people that are monitoring that part and to bring up the questions. We're going to follow the program as being received, and from that side, I will hand over after I'm finished to Professor Mandrup. That will do his part. Thereafter, we will have Professor Verlin from Belgium. Then we'll do a Q&A, we'll take a break, and then we'll run the rest of the program towards the end, where Professor Hussein Solomon will do a brief introduction of his new book. After the first 2 speakers and the Q&A, we do the water break. For the physical audience, if you need to go to an important place, exit the door to the right and to the right again. There you will find the necessary facilities. This event is recorded. After everything is finished, we'll place the recording on the SIGLA website, and we will give it to Professor Mandrup for use, I think, with the EPON project. Everybody, if you could just put your cell phones on silent, and if you have any questions with regards to the recording, you can direct it at me. This is an open conversation. We're not going to have Chatham House rules. So it's an open conversation, so please keep that in mind. After the event, we're having a small cocktail for the in-person audience, and that will be in the little foyer at the back of the library. So in order to continue, we start with the program, and the first speaker on the program is Professor Thomas Mandrup, and he'll be speaking from his work on the EPON project. He'll be speaking on the international response to hybrid threats in Africa after Afghanistan. Professor Mandrup is from the Royal Danish Defence College in Copenhagen. He's also a research fellow with SIGLA and an extraordinary professor with Stellenbosch University. So, Thomas, you next in line. And when he's finished, he'll introduce the next speaker in order to save time that we keep the event flowing. Thomas, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, colleagues and friends. It's a pleasure being here, and again being to a physical conference, coming back to South Africa after being away for a year due to COVID and stuff like that. So that's actually quite a big thing. I just need to share my PowerPoints. Window, there we are. Just need to. It's been closed. Okay, just hanging. Sorry about that. Just need to open. Here we are. Good. Right. Here we are. Good. As I said, it's a pleasure being here, and it's what I'm going to talk about today is a mix of my own research, but also input from my colleagues. Just to give you a bit of background, the EPON network is the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network run by NUPI and Cedric Koning in NUPI. We are currently around 70 international research institutions involved in this network of institutions, doing in cooperation with the AU, cooperation with the UN and the EU, doing research on peace missions around Africa, on their effectiveness, what works, what doesn't work. And we'll come back a bit about the methods and all that. We started in 2016. I was part of the first draft of the methodology. We have a common methodology, and we'll come back to that as well. And why this is, of course, is relevant is, of course, I don't know how big it is in South Africa, but in Denmark, of course, being very much involved in Afghanistan, on our way to send special forces to Operation Takuba in Mali. The debate of what can be learned. Why did we go wrong in Afghanistan? What is it that we are doing? What the big missions, life footprint, stuff like that. The new ways of organizing and trying to understand these kind of things is a big debate at the moment. And the politicians are getting cold feet because of the failure of Afghanistan in many ways, strategic failure at least. So, okay. Please record.
Okay. Can you go there?
I don't know.
Is that the one?
Yeah, that one. Good. All right. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to take from the different reports we've done. What we've done is we have taken what has the lessons learned across the studies been. So what is we can, from the different questions we ask, what is that we have learned from these missions? And it's both AU missions, it's special political missions, it's UN missions. It's also, right now, one of the next studies we're doing is on the MNJTF, G5 Sahel. So it's also on missions which are authorized by the UN, ad hoc missions, that kind of things. So we have a different set of data that actually works quite well and gives us a different, so something we can learn. And the basic idea with the EPON network was also that next time we're going to have a reform program in the UN, the next HIPPO report, we need to have some systematic data thrown into the system, which the UN then could draw upon when they formulate the new reforms of the systems, and also because there's a lot of things written around peace missions, but often like it's sporadic and not systematic in that sense. So that was the overarching ambition of that. And then if you look at the different research teams, I'm writing a new one for the new mandate renewal for MONUSCO. We're looking at the more operational but military side, which I'm going to present in New York, hopefully in November. I was part of the MONUSCO study and was also part of the UNAMID study. And it's very important to remember that when we do these studies, we are a team of researchers. We do go on field work. We do on patrols. So just before lockdown last year, when I was in Darfur, I was up in Jebel Mara Mountains to speak with the SLA rebels, all that. So we do go out to the front lines and go out there to get a better understanding of what is it that we see out there. So, and all the teams does that. Of course, why this is, of course, relevant and why we need to talk about that is because when we talk about international organizations and just involvement in Africa, this is just things going on, training missions, you have UN missions, you have EU initiatives, you have training missions, you have all these kind of things. And then we have the local ones, the G5 Sahels, you have the IGAD initiatives, and in NATO have research projects and all that. And there's a big plethora of events going on, often not coordinated, often having national interest at heart, often maybe not being used for the best purpose because it's just training, window dressing training. Again, I come from Denmark. We're very happy and very much human rights and gender, stuff like that. But always when have to be the critical question, even though I love the idea of trying to promote these kind of principles, of course, often maybe one could question, is that the best way to use the money at this stage and all that? Is the way we're doing it the best way we're doing it when we do training and not go with these forces on operation and stuff like that? So that is some of the questions, all that. Also, if you then look at how the international community, the African Union, these kinds is perceived. And again, I think Shapiro is of course always good to have this look at this. The UN in 1994, Rwanda says itself. Today, Rwanda been criticized for what it's doing in Congo. It's been for a long time. AU always been complained about, it's an ambitious project, but not being good enough, not delivering, and in the midst of people getting killed. That's been the perception for a long time. It's a bit unfair, of course. AU is deploying a lot of troops and all that. We have the international actors with the new actors. We have the BRICS coming in with alternatives with the new BRICS Development Bank and new initiatives, investments. Russians coming in now with Wagner Group and different military initiatives. You have energy investments and stuff like that. And then we have the talk club of the G20 and then the political actors and all that. But what I'm trying to say here is that this international involvement in Africa is always contested and is always under debate and all that. So, what I'm going to talk about today is the studies here. We talk about hybridity. We talk about this kind of operations. What is that we meet? And there's always, again, in a place like Darfur here. This is from my trip last year. These two were two of the local Abdul Wahid's rebels in the forepost in the Sudanese uniforms. They're taking off the soldiers dressed and all that. So it's often difficult to navigate or understand when we are out there, who is actually who and why. And quite often it's difficult to distinguish between the different actors and all that, because often in these areas, for instance, in this area, we had the Rapid Response Force, which was the former Janjaweeds, doing a lot of things that were not very nice, living amongst people. We had these guys operating in some of the refugees camps and all that on a daily basis, being rebels at night, and all the young guys and all that. So it's quite difficult to navigate in these environments. And then you have all the NGOs who says that they are, quite often they're not. Especially in these areas. This area here, it was only the second time the UN has been allowed in that area. There was no NGOs there because it took 3 hours to drive into the mountains. They thought it was too dangerous and stuff like that, which of course is another problem when we talk about that. I will come back to that. But these are the missions we've looked at the EPON network so far. The AMISOM study, I did another study related to it on focus on AMISOM and terrorism, actually similar to this study. MONUSCO, as I mentioned, UNMISS, MINUSMA in Mali. We're doing a follow-up on Mali now. CAR, of course, was done last year, and then we had the UNAMID Darfur, and then currently we just had the Cyprus one came out. We've done on about Colombia, the special political mission in Colombia, and then the OSCE mission in eastern Ukraine has also been done here. Just to not to tire you with the methodology and all that, but just to give you a bigger glimpse of what you're saying. So even we see effectiveness at the strategic impact of the peace operation in terms of mandate and resources available, right? So what is it that is possible? What the ambition? What was the mandate resources put into this? And how can we then see an effect of this? Can we do this as such? And next also here, we try to next one, right? It's a strategic level assessment. It's not a tactical level in impact, it's a strategic level impact of the effectiveness of all that. And also to try to understand in the context that it provides, to try to give them a fair understanding of what's actually going on there. And then the analytical tools we use. We take we have a context analysis. All reports I have like a context analysis of like studying what is the context we're going into, what is the history of the GATT. We look at effects, preventing violent conflict, increased stability, protection of civilians, which of course are always in the current mandates. It's something that is always there. And then of course the idea of building and fostering sustainable peace and so forth. And then there's the 6 areas, which are 6 chapters in all the studies that actually go through this. Political primacy, what is the political ambition here? Because again, there's this idea that most of these conflicts are political. It's not military problem. There's root causes and all that, but basically it's political problems which need to be solved. It can be development of local problems and all that. The military can help solve that and all that. We look at the mandate and resources. What was written in the margin of that. Of the mandates, which of kind often we have the mandate and have all that which is not set, eh? So which of course is extremely important, which is also why you need to go there to understand what is in the CONOPS and stuff like that. The people-centered approach, this is about human beings, saving human beings and stuff like that. All this legitimacy, credibility, are we there? Are we liked by the local population? I've done fieldwork in Congo many times. I still remember 2008. In Goma, where we were bombarded with rocks and other things because people hated us, right? Because we were UN coming in that side. So it's often quite, sometimes difficult to operate and all that. Then there's coordination. I will come back to that. Coherency. What is it? Does it work? And then, of course, the whole thing about women, peace, and security, which, of course, is after 1325, is also something that is so in all the mandates, which needs to be looked at as such. Good. So, cross-cutting trends and observations that have emerged from these studies. One thing is, of course, these big, and we talk about it now, that it's the death of the big missions. What do I mean by the death of the big UN missions? I mean that after Trump and they cut the budget for UN missions, the big missions are being scaled down. And Darfur has been closed. We're looking at drawdown in MONUSCO, we talked about for a long time, but the big missions, because the UN has also had this realization for a long time, they're not very good at doing offensive and robust operations and stuff like that. But again, it doesn't change the fact we deploy these type of missions to prevent large-scale violent conflicts. Right? So that is one thing. We want to end violent conflict. That's also some ambitions that we go there. We want to protect civilians. That is also part of what we're doing, why these operations are deployed. And we want to live up to 1325 and this whole idea about women protection and security. We need coherent political support, which means we need, when we go in, that's this debate. This needs to be in place. It needs to be comprehensive. It says itself, but it's quite often not the case, and I will come back to that in a moment. Why that's not often is the problem. And then, of course, the primacy of politics, which is so key here, because often these missions have been tendency to be very military focused, which of course means that it misses the objective. Again, remembering that the military can create space, but it cannot solve the political issue. So politics must come first, which of course is, but that's quite often quite a problem. Then the people-centered approach, that is also a problem, because often we haven't got the resources. Again, I can use my studies in Congo. When you have a new strategy called protection via projection, which means that you have few bases and then you have an intelligence and then you project your forces out there, but you haven't got anything to project with, then it's not a very good strategy. It's very difficult to actually implement. The same goes with Darfur. Again, you have a few number of soldiers, the roads are bad, so it takes you 3 hours to drive 30 kilometers. How do you do that with such a few number, with that kind of ambition? So these kind of things we need to have also handle. And then, of course, also, this one is also quite important, that headquarters and all that, when we talk about these things, it's actually important that we have impact, we have ownership from headquarter level, that there's strategic interest in what's going on and they actually do something about it and try to help us get something right. All right. Good. What was the findings then from some of the missions? All right, we take the first one, AMISOM, MONUSCO, MINUSMA. One of the findings of the three reports was that there was a significant contribution to preventing major civil war and large-scale conflicts. That was okay. We can go into the details. AMISOM, 2007, through blocks in Mogadishu, the airport, maybe a bit of the harbor. Looking at Somalia today, very different story. We can always have the Afghanistan discussion, whether it holds and if they were left, what would happen, all that. But there's been some progress and there's more stability than there was at that time, where it was a full-scale war. MONUSCO, civil war. Yeah? Remember going back in the early first part of the conflict in the 90s, again 2002 to 2006 and all that, where you have the elections and then you have the upscale again. You have the different phases, but UN has played. We can be critical on the UN. We can be critical of not doing enough, but they have played a role to actually stop atrocity and have that deterrent effect on these kind of in these areas. MINUSMA, to a certain extent, was the finding. This report from MINUSMA was 2018. Today, of course, things are going the wrong way in MINUSMA. We have to be quite adamant and quite clear around that. It's not looking good. We have the insurgents are getting closer to Bamako in the whole Lepidco area and all that. So it's critical at the moment. But in general, one would say, if you look at northern part of Mali, stuff like that, we have had a lot of progress up there. So deterrence has been a good thing. One thing that has been critical around these missions, it was UNMISS. UNMISS, for instance, is a good example of a mission that hasn't delivered in reference on this one, because it didn't have the ability to prevent 2013 and 2016. The outscale of war, what they did, and of course, they opened the camp for refugees and stuff like that, but it didn't have the necessary effect in going into this kind of things, which of course is critical. And then it has to have to look to why. Was it because of lack of political cooperation? Was it lack of intelligence, lack of capabilities? There could be many reasons why, but it's been a very difficult mission and not been successful in that sense. But basically, what the conclusion is from the different studies is that if we withdraw these missions, whether we like them or not, there's a big risk that these would actually be much worse off than it would have been if they're were not here. And it's quite interesting. And again, I can use a very concrete example from our study where I was down in southern Kivu. We went on patrol with the Pakistanis, like 60 kilometers up north and through a rebel-controlled area. And there was a local FRDC battalion, and we had a community interaction and all that. And we asked them, okay, but what about UN? I mean, do you want UN here? Yeah, please, yes, UN here. But why do you need UN? You have a battalion up there. No, we can't trust them. So there's this thing that you do not trust the local security forces. So the local security forces are threats or not. They are part of the rebel problem. They're part of the whole problem because the state is a problem in general. So that is also why one of the things here. So these communities want that. Politically, it's quite different. For instance, both Kinshasa and Juba has for a long time asked for the UN missions to leave because they didn't want them there for obvious reasons also, because it's quite and that's help them a lot. So ending violent conflict. One can say that that's maybe not been where there's been most successful. With the end these missions, look at CARDIS, DRC, Mali, Somalia, South Sudan, we still got conflict. So the missions have not been able to live up to that mandate. The question is also, is that realistic? It's realistic that with current mandate, with the policy you have available and tools available, can you do that? And the problem is also, one of them things is the political guidance, and the political project. What are the political strategic projects of the missions being there? That's often not very clear. One could maybe, if I had to take it out of this study, look at what's going on in Mozambique at the moment. What is the political project of deploying up there? What is our objective? Can that actually help, and can that solve some of these things as well? Often also the political support are not there. Again, one can say, for instance, maybe some of you have deployed to Darfur. You know how difficult it was to operate in Darfur, for instance, to get logistics, to get just visas for members, to get ammunition, to be allowed to try to move around by the local government because the government blocked you all the time. And there was no support from the UN Security Council level to actually put pressure on, or ability to put pressure on the Sudanese government to change these policies, which makes it extremely difficult and dangerous to operate in these areas and without political support. So again, you can argue that this is also part of that problem. So the conclusion from these studies, again, sustainability bringing an end to violent conflict can only be achieved by political means. So again, it needs to have political pressure to actually go out and solve these political problems by political masters by putting pressure and getting buy-in from the local authorities. And it's also, when we talk about this, there's also, and again, that's from AMISOM, there's a doctrinal crisis here in the sense that, for instance, AMISOM is trying to do a coin/counterterrorism operation on a UN PSO doctrine. And that is not applicable because they cannot support logistically out in the areas where they need. They cannot provide the logistical support that is needed for that kind of operations. They cannot have the assets to run operations like that. So that is also one of the problems here. Geography and infrastructure is a big problem in that ending conflict because our response time is too long. Also, we operate in silos. Often these missions, you have the military, you have the civilian side, or if you have intelligence, it's becoming better now with the new intelligence reform in the UN system. You can actually cut across and better intelligence. Previously, it was like often that when we did these studies, crucial intelligence met at the SRSG's level only, because the civilian and military side did not talk to each other. And then, of course, knowledge. Often when we go into these missions, the contingents being deployed, knowledge of local circumstances was often not enough or often absent. Again, a good example, I've been in Hong Kong many times. I remember, again, it was in 2010, I think, we had the new head of the SSR program, a French colonel coming from Afghanistan and said, now I have a new plan how to do SSR. And it changed the whole system. And they have been running an SS program for 5 years, and everyone's looking at it, what are you doing? But again, this coming out without understanding the local context, without really coming in and all that. So that's also one of the issues we're faced with. Good. Protection of civilians. These missions, of course, up there, has been a disappointment in protection of civilians. Civilian casualties has been a big issue. Again, early on in the Congo mission, we've had all the massacres. We've had UN soldiers standing a few kilometers away, not reacting. Sometimes they would say because we didn't know. Often they would also say that it's because they didn't want to, was outside their mandate, because there's been this mandate discussion, interpretation of the mandate. It might be you have a Chapter 7 mandate, but you don't actually go in and you interpret yourself put limits on yourself, that you're not going to operate outside this or more Chapter 6 plus. What does that mean in practice? Again, an Indian colonel explained it quite good to me. Our job here is not to support the Force Intervention Brigade. Our job here is to protect and keep the road open and patrol the local areas we're here. We're not going to do anything else. Then, of course, we had the Dos Santos report in late 18. That's changed a bit, but that, of course, but it just shows you that some of these problems are here. And again, the local population plays the brunt of this, and that has been something we can find around these operations as such. Often they also don't have the resources to do it, and that's also part of the problem here. Good. Yeah. This is also a very critical area of this study in general. Women, peace and security. Again, we have had mixed at best, often quite bad experiences here. We have some more focus on it. One of the problems with women, peace and security and the focus on gender in these kind of missions, often it's add-on. So when you go into a UN headquarters, quite often, next time you go, have a look. The gender office is quite often placed in the container on the right corner, in the first corner of the camp. Often, if they do a new strategy, they do the strategy and then they add the gender issue in the end, because we need some gender. Now I'm a caricature here, but it is partly true, and it's become better, but it's not been integrated into the thinking of this because it's not been prioritized. So it's been something that we've added on later on. Then the next problem, of course, has been this one down here, and there's both a problem around the forces deployed, which of course we can talk long about, South Africa's experience, the history around that, but we can also talk about how locally sexual exploitation and abuse is part of conflict, and that we haven't been able to actually stop this. And that has been very, as the report, our conclusion is, disappointing and unsatisfactory for that kind of study, for this kind of operations in general. Then there's this political support, and that's quite important. Often we need that alignment between these institutions to have effective responses. But again, remember the first Darfur operation. If you look at the margins of that mandate given, China has written, you're not going to do A, Y, and Z. Russia has written, no, you're not going to do that, which puts a lot. It might be that you have a robust mandate on paper, but in reality, your ability to move is very limited. And if you then, on top of that, have troop contribution countries that actually do not operate and do not accept the command of the force commander or the mandate they're given, because they have to call their capitals first before they will move, or before they will clear a roadblock or whatever, then that's a problem. I interviewed the former AMIS UNAMID commander, a Nigerian general. He said, I was not a force commander, I was a force manager. Force manager, I had no control. I had to put Nigerian forces in all sectors because that was the only ones I could count on will actually react when I asked them to do. A Pakistani colonel told me, before we came here, we were deployed on the border to Afghanistan. We had also been, before that, we cleared the Swat Valley of Islamists. And now we're here. So this mission for us is not a holiday, but it's not a mission where my political master will accept I come home with soldiers and body bags. So that is the mentality in the midst of Congo, in a conflict where you have the Chapter 7, where you have rebels running around and all that. So that's also, so the coherency here. So there's a lot of political players, national interest and all that, which is quite difficult.
Thomas.
Yeah, I know. So they have only, peace missions are quite difficult often also because if you don't have host government support, that's the other part of this. You cannot operate, you cannot force upon, of course, that's all knowledge, but the reports also show that you cannot, if you don't have ownership from the local government that want you to be there, you cannot be a success because they will not try to implement that. And then again, you could take AMISOM, you could take UNAMID, you could take UNMISS, you can take MONUSCO, partly also MINUSMA. We have the same problem here that local government is not playing ball and they have their own political interests, which makes it extremely difficult to actually do this. Yeah. Then there's the comprehensiveness, right? As I said before, I talked about it before, these missions quite often operate in silos. So the integration of that is extremely difficult. So again, we cannot see the military tool as isolated. It's a tool that can enable other tools for happening. But what's that? How is that a problem in practice? In AMISOM, it's a problem because the commanders there. I spoke to he's now the head of the Kenyan Army, Defense Force. Sorry, he used to be head army, and he said we are so tired of clearing the same village for the 5th time because the local security forces are not coming. When we clear from rebels, it's not coming, and they see us now as occupiers, not as liberators. So as long as there's not this coherency that you actually have comprehensive approach, that means that you have the civilian side and NGOs and judicial presence in coming in these areas, it's a problem, it won't work. That's one thing. So that's one of the issues here, which makes it extremely difficult that they have this silo thinking that is actually not, makes it quite operational. Good. Then the findings, and that's back to the whole thing I started by, primacy of politics. Many of these missions did not have or lacked still a political project. So we are there to do that, conflict management. We're there to stop, and then we hope that some kind of political project will emerge from that. But often there's no strategy. There's no strategy on how to do that. And these missions have shown that this has often been the case. So we go there, okay, we cannot solve the political crisis, we cannot solve the conflict, but we can then protect some civilians. Or we can stabilize, stop the conflict from escalating or whatever. But the wider trying to solve the bigger issues have not been very good. And then, of course, so there's a real need to reconsider how we can do this differently, how it can be sustained. Where we support political elites, entrench them, try to not can solve these kind of things. And also, I also block for long-term settlement, because what we've seen quite often is we see these projects being short-term elections. We want to have elections, then it's success. Eh? Remember again Congo 2006. I remember I was there in 2004. We had the stiff description of a plan. We have 2006 elections. Then we can go. We can leave. Right? It didn't happen. We're still there. So how do we do this without making blocking for this long-term settlement, not to service and serve the interest of political elites? How do we get around that without also push them away? Because that's also a problem. Quite often these elections, all that, the political solutions we create, it's the elites that comes back and do the same, go into power again. Good. One of the things here, and which of course is extremely difficult not to do, is the whole idea about being state-centric. We go in, we have an agreement, come via the capital, we have a mandate, we go in from the top. Often, maybe problems should be solved bottom up. Maybe problems should be solved where local problems are. They tried that in Congo with the StarRec system, where they had a new strategy where instead of having a strategy of trying to solve across the country, they tried to identify special trouble areas, and then they try to go in and solve the problems, focus on that. But that's sometimes turned out to be quite difficult also because often, again, the coordination between different departments and stuff like that and cooperation with the local forces are not always that good. Next thing is also that the connection between the local military forces, the UN forces or the AU forces and the local population is not always good. There can be security reasons for that. There can also be practical that you are not very good at doing this, going out and having the kind of outreach roles. But that's actually, that's quite problematic when you have to protect them and all that. So you need to go out and create, interest and create trust from the local population to be able to actually solve this kind of get that connection and be able to solve this problem with people-centric. Time is running. Also, one of the things that also the reports found that we have not been very good. I know again, I've been to many UN missions over the years, and we do have meetings with local communities and try to talk to civil representatives and stuff like that. But that has actually been one of the problems here, that often the coordination between that has not been good enough, and it's actually they have very rarely the missions have the input. They understand the impact this has. The whole idea of we just need some quick impact projects. If you're the ones who've been in UN missions, know quick impact projects is actually maybe it's good for certain things, but for the wider, larger things, it's not maybe the best solution for actually getting into touch and being focused on getting connection to the local population and legitimacy and all these kind of things. And again, operations. They are cooperating with the state center, they're cooperating with New York, and especially in the national governments, and that's a big issue here. Good. In conclusion, the reports, the studies have found that there's a significant role preventing large-scale violence and conflict and war. It hasn't solved the wars quite often by their own because it can only be done locally, and the missions have not quite often have difficulty finding that. The missions often have been unable to protect what we would like for local protection of civilians, women's security. It's often coherent political support is critical, but often lacking. We have often been security managers where the political primacy has been neglected. So again, the focus on the political solution that could contain some kind of sustainability is actually quite often absent. We also need to be better of integrating the whole idea of comprehensiveness, of course, need to be implemented in reality. A good example again, OCHA in the area we worked in Darfur, the missing complaints that OCHA had just arrived 2 weeks before us. They wanted to start 2 new projects in the area. And they went out to 2 villages without coordinating with the military force that had been there for 1.5 years and knew the villages. Because OCHA had their own idea. And as the political advisor said, one of the villages made sense, the other didn't. So they just wanted, so again, this example, they're not using the resources available. And we see that in all these kind of missions. We need also to be able to have not the state-centric, but move to be people-centered to actually what is it that evolves around the areas where we deployed. How can we solve that kind of study? And then, of course, we need to pay more attention to the political, going back to New York and the other compartments, say what are they doing and how can we get support? Because it's from there. Again, UNAMID is the extreme case where it was very difficult to operate for a very long time, because they didn't have support from New York to actually implement the mandate, and they allowed the Sudanese government to act in this way. So that was it. Raising a lot of questions, and also again, what can we learn from this? Also in terms of future operations, especially after now, where again, what I said, debate around the Foreign Office in Denmark, for instance, is that Mali is turning into Afghanistan 2.0. is the idea. I think it's wrong. It's a misreading of the situation, but we can debate that. But there's some food for thought here. The EPON network is online. The reports are for free. We have, of course, the larger reports, and there's coming smaller reports out as well, but more political focused and all that. So I'll better stop here. Thank you. Good. And then, yeah, I will. We'll take questions in the end after Nina's presentations. Nina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Good, good. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I do.
Okay, good. I'll just do a short introduction. It's Professor Nina Villen. Nina is the Director of African Studies at the Egmont College in Brussels, but also an associate professor with University of Lund in Sweden. Also she is the senior editor of the International Peacekeeping Journal. So Nina is well developed in I know a lot about Africa and worked in these areas for a long time. And I know what I asked her to do for this study is because Nina did, and she will most likely talk about that, she did field work with the Special Forces in Niger last year. So it's a lot of this is what her study is going to talk about is based on her work from last year. So Nina, I'm very happy that you accepted to enlighten us. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know, can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. So yes, as Thomas said, I'm here to present some of my research on security force assistance in Niger today. And it's based on field research that I've done over the past 3 years in Miami. So during the coming 15 minutes or so, I'll present some of the key findings of this. Some of it was published in an article that came out a few weeks ago that's called Analyzing Informal Relations and Networks in Security Force Assistance, the case of Niger. But today I will try to focus on the aspects that are more related to the local context, because that's what I was asked to do. Just to say that the overall aim of the article is to increase our understanding of how security force assistance is developing in the field and what's happening on the ground, and how can we explain this through theoretical concepts. So the outline of my presentation is as follows. First, I will try to present the key arguments of my research and explain how it relates to the topic at hand today. And then I will draw examples from my fieldwork to explain both the importance of social network analysis, which is the theoretical framework that I used in the article, but also some empirical examples to show how you can adapt to local context during security force assistance missions. So to start, studies on security force assistance have been dominated by different iterations of the principal agent perspective to explain relations between providers and recipients. So the principal, usually a Western partner state, is the provider, and that person or that actor brings training and equipment and sometimes also courses that are to be taught to the agent, which is usually a fragile state in need of security force assistance. So the host nation's security forces. And this security force assistance is then characterized by this rather hierarchical and simple relationship. And this is just an image to illustrate how the principal agent, and I'm of course simplifying this, but the idea of the principal agent framework. So these principal agent frameworks are very good at illustrating these dynamics from a macro perspective, but I'm arguing that they are not enough to analyze the complexity on the ground, which involves a lot of different actors, both different providers, but also different types of security forces from the local community that is being trained or assisted or partnered, if you want to. But it's also that there are other types of actors, not just military actors, but there are also civilian actors. And we heard in Thomas' presentation about NGOs, different types of UN missions, EU missions, bilateral and multilateral missions. So these are actors that are part of the security context in which security force assistance need to be adapted to, and actors within the security force assistance need to adapt to. So to better explain this complexity, I adopt concepts from social network analysis, and I try to provide an in-depth micro-analysis of relations between different providers, security force providers, and Niger as the host community, focusing on the Belgian Special Forces. And in my study, I point to timing, contingency, and individual encounters, both formal and informal encounters, as central to understand how security force assistance develops and at times strays from strategy on the ground. So this is the, let's say, the dominant perspective, and this is how I would like to present that the reality on the ground is. So a lot more complex than just a hierarchical relationship between a principal and an agent. So just to briefly go into the idea of why I use a social network analysis perspective, it's one of the core ideas of the SNA is that the patterning of the social ties in which actors are embedded has important implications, both for those actors, but also for the context in general. So that means that if you have a central position in a network, then you also have a quite important social capital, and you can influence more easily other actors. And that goes both for the recipient and for the providers. So for the recipient, this myriad of other actors and providers of security force assistance also means that there is a possibility to multiply ties and connections, and also to put providers in competition with each other. The latest examples that we've seen of this recently is in Mali, where Malian authorities have drawn in a new provider in this social network in the shape of Wagner, the Russian mercenaries, which of course messes up the network and puts question into who is providing what and where are the connections, creating a bit of chaos. So this pictures that you have in front of you is also illustrating that idea of building relationships, trust, and adapting to local context becomes essential if security force assistance is to have any impact, even if it's just on a tactical or technical dimension. I'm not going into the macro idea of security force assistance here. So how do you do that? How do you build relationships? How do you build trust? And how do you adapt to local context? So I will try to illustrate some examples from what I've seen in the field and with the Belgian Special Forces, but I'm sure that there are other forces who do the same thing. But this is from my point of view then. One important aspect is, of course, recognizing and acknowledging the reality on the ground is complex, much more than in the principal agent perspective. So that means that you recognize and you connect with other actors, not just the local forces, but also other actors, both local and international, both civilian and military. So here is one example from the Belgian Special Forces, who I argue in this article that they acquired quite a central position given their limited weight on international, partly because they have been able and keen to set up coordinating meetings and social practices between different international partners, Nigerian key actors, and actors from civil society, which have generated more opportunities for expanding and multiplying these security force assistance activities. So one of the things that they've started with is what they've called the soft fusion cell, so Special Operation Forces fusion cell meetings, in the framework of this quite large fourth generation project that's underway in Niger now to set up different special intervention battalions. And it has been underway since about 2018 and is supposed to finish late next year. So within this bigger fourth generation project, one of the ideas from the Belgians then has been to coordinate between the different providers and the Nigerian host authorities on how to do things, how to coordinate activities, and make sure that you don't duplicate different types of courses, assistance, but also to make sure that you have the same equipment, so that one force is not coming in with one type of equipment that's not interoperable, that's not working with other forces' equipment. So from a social network perspective, the establishment of the fusion cell meetings can be described as a subgroup or a clique of the broader social network that the fourth generation project constitutes. So these meetings are informal. They take place between a group of people, where there is a group, some sort of a degree of a group feeling, and in which a certain norm, a group norm of behavior has been established. And the similarities between the people participating in these meetings are quite evident. They are all in Miami, so the location is similar. They're of the same gender most of the time. They're working in similar organizations. They all come from different military organizations. And in this context, what's important that I find that's important is that they all identify as special forces, which is a strong identity marker, both outside the military, but also within the military between different departments and divisions. And in terms of social relations, they're all working together as providers to the Niger military. So they're interacting and collaborating through the meetings, and thereby also contributing to flows of information and at times of resources. Another way to connect and to expand networks has been to go beyond the military sphere to engage with civilian actors that are in Niamey, in Niger. And they've done that through organizing bi-weekly social gatherings, events with drinks and snacks for a wide range of civilian and military actors to interact, to exchange experiences, and to discuss best practices. So these meetings could include expat staff from NGOs, multilateral missions from the EU, or embassy personnel, in addition then to local military and foreign militaries that are there. And I think that Belgium's central role in the field of social networking is not coincidental, but it's part of their strategy to build trust among key contacts, both between Western partner nations, but also then, of course, between the Nigerian actors on the ground. And the understanding is that building these social networks will open up new opportunities for collaboration and gradually diminish obstacles. So obstacles can be, for example, differences between providers, but it can also be difficulties to understand the local context. And I will just give two empirical examples of how that can take place on the ground. So one example, when there was a lack of understanding of the local context, was between the Nigerian forces and some of the Western partner nations in this larger fourth generation project, was when the Nigerian militaries wanted to prioritize the standing up of combat companies before the support and logistics companies in these new special intervention battalions. So from a Western point of view, it's necessary to have staff and support companies sustaining combat companies to ensure that there is logistical support needed for combat companies in theaters. So usually the staff and support companies are the first ones that are stood up in a battalion. However, that's not the case in Niger, because historically or traditionally, each combat company has always supported themselves out of necessity and also about efficiency of personnel. Each company is therefore supposed to be able to maintain and repair equipment, and if this is not the case, then soldiers will, for example, require support from local artisans when convoys or patrols go through villages. And similarly, soldiers procure food and water from local merchants while in a convoy, making the support company useful, but not a priority when standing up new battalions in wartime. So given the lack of manpower and the multiple fronts that the Nigerian forces have to cover at the moment, the combat companies are considered a priority for the Nigerians. So understanding and adapting to this local context is one of those issues that makes it make security force assistance more sustainable if you manage to actually see this through the perspective of local forces. Then it's also clear that there are problematic issues, aspects as well. Not always support military companies with technicals in an ad hoc manner, and that's not without any problems. But that's a second issue that can be discussed later. In this case, the example that I'm presenting here, it ended up with Western partner nations agreeing with the Nigerian authorities that they would set up the combat companies before the support companies because they were seen as a priority. And just a second example of adapting to the local context. As I just explained, the security context in Niger is quite dire at the moment and is deteriorating as we're speaking, given the neighborhood is basically chaotic at the moment, with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger now experiences attacks on many fronts. And that has resulted in the Nigerian armed forces being deployed to about 80% of its effectiveness, which means that there is no pool of specialized trainers or instructors in the armed forces to give training. And this has been a problem in military schools and academies, as anyone with recognized capabilities will be deployed, making the combat companies in theater more effective rather than training new recruits. So the implications and institutional memory, and ultimately there's also a risk that you increase dependency on foreign trainers to ensure continuity. So in order to sustain the courses and the trainings given, one idea that was materialized in this security force systems project has been to develop a standardized program of instruction between the Nigerian Special Forces and the Western partner nations, driven in particular then by the Belgian Special Forces. And the program consists of over 18 courses and various different techniques, and it's both a procedure on acting as a program of instruction, but also as a course manual for future trainers. The POI, so the program of instructions, it contains several videos, a number of images adapted to local context, in the sense that they've been developed from already existing Nigerian techniques and procedures. And videos that have been made by and with local forces using both French and then local languages, so that it should be easy accessible to everyone. And the idea behind these standardized courses is, of course, that not each provider should come in with their way of doing things and then making a sort of a hodgepodge idea of courses, but that each course should be taught in the same way and with the same sort of implications for how they should behave in the field, what type of procedures and operations and how they should be used in the field. But also that any of the Nigerian trainers or instructors that are left in the institutions can actually give these courses without any foreign support. That these courses have been developed together with the Nigerians so that they should be able to continue to give them after the foreign forces are no longer there to assist them. So just to conclude, the findings of the research that I've done in Niger so far suggest that informal networks and contingency are important aspects to take into account if we are to understand how security force assistance develops on the ground, and at times strays from strategy, which has been a common complaint about security force assistance, often deviating into unintended and unexpected ways. A second finding is that reality is complex, and there is a myriad of different actors connecting in distinct ways, and their position within the network partly determines their social capital and their influence. So social network analysis can help us to disentangle this myriad of actors and this complexity and increase our understanding of what's happening on the ground. And then finally, for providers, developing connections, trust, and adapting to local context is essential in order to have a sustainable influence on the ground. And I'll finish with this.
Right. Thank you for that, Nina. We will now commence and see if we can have some questions after the applause. I know that there was a specific question that was directed to Thomas and Nina.
Yeah.
You want to respond to the question?
What question?
Okay, I thought it came up.
Oh, my computer's not working.
Okay, sorry. From Jan Wits.
Yeah.
East Asian Africa.
Oh, yeah. Nina, have you seen the question?
I'm reading. It's
Yeah.
a long question. I
Yeah, have
didn't
you
expect less from Jan Wood. Yeah, I'm reading it now.
Do you want to start?
No, you go ahead. I'm still reading.
A long question.
If there are questions from the floor,
Yeah.
there's
So
a
have
way.
you read it out loud, Thomas?
Yeah, but it's very long. So should I read it out? Okay, we can observe an expanding threat as IS also Daesh also even especially in Africa. Daesh, although not unitarian movement, rejects the Westphalian state order both at the ideological and the operational level. Are there approaches being considered that a mimic of non-Westphalian outlook to address that threat? 2, obviously, IS is a very violent movement. Yet, does labeling it as a terrorist organization help degrading its capacity influence? Would this not impede more holistic assessments and approaches? Would it not be more useful to consider this as, for instance, an insurgency movement, albeit one with a beyond a Westphalian state agenda? Many initiatives remain primarily concerned with counterterrorism agendas. Yeah, if I would like to start with question 2 then, if I need to try to answer this, Jan, which of course is a difficult one. I think the thing about labeling something as a terrorist organization is always a double-edged sword. I guess the Mozambican case right now is also a good example of that. That you, on the one hand, for the terrorist organization itself, by being labeled a terrorist organization suddenly means that you are on the run from international actors like the US and others. It allows for deployment of training missions or the missions we see right now because you're part of that terrorist network, which of course makes you more vulnerable if it's a local conflict and so forth. So there's a danger here of being targeted, and also your individuals being on the list of being approached or attacked or from international actors. On the flip side of that, you can say that again, in the case of Al Sunna, it's in Mozambique, it has allowed for financial support from international level. It's allowed for international fighters, maybe especially from East Africa, coming down. It's allowed for anecdotal at least, but a very connection between also organizations like ADF in the Eastern Congo and other places. So suddenly you are part of this. Mark Shaw has this concept of local conflicts, which is local conflicts that are locally based, which are tied up to something that is bigger and a bigger quest, which of course makes it is a bigger fight and makes it maybe give you more capability to actually achieve more with the objectives and so forth. So I think I would argue that it's a double-edged sword. But I think in terms of we would take Afghanistan and a good example for that. Of course, as long as we call someone terrorist and we're not willing to talk to them, it's going to be very difficult to actually solve the conflict. We did a study, as I said, in AMISOM. We looked at this for the AU. We did a study on the terrorist threats towards AMISOM, and what came out was that out of at that time estimated 7,000 to 8,000 Al-Shabaab fighters. A few hundred, maybe 500-600 were key kind of radical elements. The rest were there for other reasons, basically. Right? So the core here. So the question was, how can we maybe attack and target the few in the center, and avoid alienating the others who are there, I mean, for instance, for security or economic reasons and all that, which are not necessarily born jihadists, stuff like that. So I think we have to be very careful how we do this. And I think with the new, without going into it too much, the new Operation Takuba, which of course is partly replacing the drawdown of Bakan in Mali. The whole idea of have this light footprint where you use special forces elements to target leadership or target these core areas, and not being present with large scale forces is maybe a better way to try to target those we're after, and not necessarily the larger group. And again, if you take Mali, Lipitko Triangle, we know there's alliances between IS and Daesh and local militias and all that, but it's not necessarily, I would argue, because they are Islamists, but it's because they are in a situation where they need to survive and they need to adhere to who is actually the power broker in that area, and they need to navigate that as well. So that's a lot of, as Nina says, things are complicated, but I think I think a lot of these explanations we need to take into account as well. So it was I know a bit fluffy answer to your question too. Sorry.
Should I complement a little with my point? Yeah, I think that Thomas is right, that it's a double-edged sword, definitely. But I also think it's not to forget that there is advantages for host governments to label different group terrorists, because that enables them to ask for counterterrorism courses, counterterrorism equipment, and security force assistance. And we've seen that, especially Uganda, for example, that has been labeling LRA as a terrorist organization, that has enabled them to get quite a lot of security force assistance. But now we also have seen DRC starting to label the ADF in the east of Congo as a terrorist organization. And as soon as you have the label terrorist, then you also make it much easier to get security force assistance from Western partner nations. So I think that that's an important aspect. And then, of course, as Thomas said, that once you label an organization a terrorist organization, then they get publicity. It becomes easier for them to recruit from different countries, not just from the local. But another side effect is that you kind of simplify the context in which they are working, so that you kind of forget that there is a local context that's feeding the grievances of the different armed actors in the region. And when you take the terrorist label, then it makes it sound so simple, whereas there are local grievances, conflicts, and so on, which has fueled these conflicts over years before. It's not just that the IS is deploying their armed groups in that area. It's because there is a problem, and often the host government has just ignored that over years. Okay, I'll finish that there.
Yep.
Can we take a question from the floor? Let's just mute this.
Thank you very much for the question. It depends very much on the individual. Some people are quite effective in that role. Some people are also as an institution able to place themselves as that coordinating factor. But again, take the Congo, for instance, is a good example of that. That for periods of time, you've had competing interests, where not necessarily that the UN, for instance, has not had that kind of main seat, so to speak. So it's often depends on the person. Who are they willing to do that? Are they willing to have the capacity to do that? Have they got the support to do that? Especially also if it's a mission where there's a lot of strong political interests, it can often be quite difficult. For instance, the UN had, in Darfur, they had a problem there because they hadn't got a very bad access to the government. So that was why, when we look at different models, we have AMISOM as this is not a hybrid model, but UN is providing the politics and logistics, and you have the military by A, and then you have the hybrid mission as a model in UNAMID. The thing is, of course, that here it was the AU had the good contact. It was the AU that had the ability to sometimes to get Bashir's government at the time to play ball and try to change things and make things work a bit, because the UN at the time could not do that. So it depends very much on the situation, political context, and all that. But it is an important function if you've got the right people there. Hold on.
I actually didn't hear the question, and I don't think that the people on the hybrid side of the event did either. Could you just repeat it, please?
It was the question was on the UN resident coordinator, what the experiences was from different missions from that role.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Close. Yeah.
Mute the mic.
I'm sorry, I don't think the hybrid version of the seminar can hear anything.
Yeah, try again. Yeah. The question was in our study and the framework which was listed, focus was on politics and was on the military, and not so much on the social dynamics of the conflicts and the social dynamics on the ground. Yeah, exactly. That's why we have the initial reports where these things are covered. So we have the report itself. If we go through the reports, we have there is a description of the conflict, the dynamics of the conflict, and so forth, and how. And then we have the when we go into the different cases, it is a strategic level analysis. It's not a tactical level. So it is where we're looking at the overarching ambition of the mission to actually achieve this. So we use examples of that. So for instance, when we look at women protection or that, you will use case examples from the areas we visit. We will use local examples of dynamics, how they try to implement, how they try to interact, what the role of the local women protection officer is, and all that. For instance, protection of civilians, we would look in the Congo, for instance, we would look at different initiatives on how did they try to change and improve the ability of the force to actually locally integrate and try to in the local conflicts dynamics and so forth. So it is part of the report. So it's some of the backdrop of it. Yeah. So it is covered, but it is, of course, we're looking at the missions and how what is the mandate, what are they trying to achieve, and how is that done, and then the other things are there as well as like a back rope. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Shall I just speak up?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, can you hear, Nina?
Can you hear me?
No.
Why don't you go stand and pose the question up front?
Yeah.
It was not a good idea.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do this.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Now I
So
can hear you.
I think my question actually was for Thomas, but maybe you might want to jump in. The question is, Thomas has identified the fact that these missions are leaving their locales without, in fact, having secured the situation. Let me take the case of Darfur, where you've got 1.2 million IDPs still in the camps, 700,000 weapons in circulation. UNAMID is now drawing down and pulling out, and all is left to the Sudanese Sovereign Council to try to actually manage the situation. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. So we might see an escalation of violent conflict. So what are the effective, and you mentioned CAR, Mali, South Sudan, same challenge. What are the processes that we need to be putting in place for the exit strategy to actually be effective? I think you didn't mention it. You touched upon it, like you just kind of glazed and you kind of dove in and then you took off again on the social, which I think is the same question, really. Kind of let's spell those out a little bit more, because I think even though we've got very good analysis of the hard security stuff, the soft security seems to kind of go amiss, right? And I think particularly in this context, when we're talking to soldiers and airmen and naval men and so on, I think it's very important for that to be understood, that you can only go up to a certain point. And when you pull out the same things that you try to address are not been addressed. I know it's less sexy than bullets, guns, tanks, planes, but I think that really is the place we need to put our energy.
Yeah, for sure.
And then also these wonderful reports that EPON is doing, are they feeding into the policy makers?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so to answer the last question, yes, they are. They have been presented. I've been to New York myself and presented some of the work to the AU, done the same. And we're going again and all that. So it has been feeding into this system. The question around the root causes of the conflict, and that's again in our studies. It's also the primacy of politics. That's also that heading kind of thing, because it is, as we said, this is political, it's local, it's and all that. And again, you can be quite frank. You know, we were in Darfur just the last legs of the mission. They knew they were most likely going to be draw down and close. There was the assessment mission came 2 months after us. Was the conflict solved? No. Was the local population scared? Yes. Why? Because the new strongman in the new regime in Sudan is the Rapid Response Force, which is the old Janjaweeds. And they were still there. So in the area where we were, in all the area up where local to the rebels, all that, the local commander, the local intelligence chief, they were the same. So and again, so these things are not solved. But the question is also, and that's back to this question is, for instance, the UN had only been allowed to that area, Golo, where we were, they'd only been allowed to deploy there for 2 years before in a long mission, because Sudan until then has blocked access to that area. So it points back to this thing about the soft thing. The military can create space. It can create space for these soft things to happen, but it depends very much on the willingness of the local authorities, the local communities to actually go into this kind of dialogue, and also that we foster this kind of dialogue as well. One of the problems, again, AMISOM, Somalia, good example. Again, as I mentioned also, the problem here is that we go into villages, we use military means to clean them out, or the rebels out. And then we look around and we look for governments, we look for NGOs. Where are they? Who is going to follow up? And how are you ever going to believe in a state if you cannot see it? Again, Somalia is a good example. That people, they would often say, yes, okay, but we know you're going to leave. The AMISOM actually had a good example. They had been to a village. They went in. There was no Al-Shabaab, and then hours after they left, suddenly the black flags were up again. And then they went in to see why are Al Shabaab back? No, Al Shabaab was not back, but the local population was fearful that they knew Al Shabaab was coming back at one stage, so they wanted to make sure that they showed allegiance to, so they couldn't be punished by all that. So what I'm trying to get at it here is that all these social small things, it needs to be owned and run with support from international community, of course, but we need to be better at coordinating that. We need to understand with having better intelligence, for instance, also on what is the mechanisms here, what are the causes of this conflict, what is the local dynamics here, and we don't do that by having UN forces sitting in camps, being static, or AU forces doing the same. So, and again, and then there's the political reality. I remember Martin van Crefeld, he said it once. We had him to lecture for some students. He said, the West, the international community, can never win wars, or these kind of wars. Why? Because we haven't got time, like the Brits in Northern Ireland, because they knew they were going to stay, so they didn't have to use power, or much power, or we didn't have the means, abilities like the old Assad in Syria, where he knew there was insurgency here and just went in and he killed everybody. So no one could come out after him. And we can't do, so we're in between. And you know, as we haven't got, and Darfur is the best example. Was the conflict solved? No. But New York wanted this mission to close. Full stop. Is it done? No. We're tired, we don't want to be there anymore. The same with Congo. They've been tired of this mission for a long time. If you ask, like when we were there doing the field work, some of the UN officials said, we don't know why we're here anymore. You know, we're doing our best, but why are we in reality? Why are we here? So, yeah, you're quite right. We put these missions in, but we don't solve the root causes of what is, and therefore maybe we can put, again, we are security managers. That's what's the founding. We're security managers. We're not creating sustainable peace solutions. We're not ending conflicts. Nina?
Can I add on that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also thinking that we come back to all of these EU missions. We come back to the same questions of local ownership and political will. And if there is no local ownership, and if there is no political will, not from the host government to actually create a more stable situation, nor from the people intervening, so from, let's say, from the UN headquarters to stay, well, then there is not going to be any solution. And if there is no state, as Thomas said, about that can provide basic services, then it's so easy for different armed groups to recruit local population. You have families where they have, let's say, this is the anecdote, but it's quite a telling example, where you have 3 sons, one who is in the military, one who is the police, and one who is in one of the rebel forces, to make sure that at least you have somebody to protect you. And I think that that's a telling example, right? Because you know that the state is not there to protect you. And as long as you have a state that's not willing to or capable of providing these services to the population, then a UN mission can take down the number, or it can reduce the number of victims, and it can reduce, and it can act as a stabilizing factor, but it's not there to solve the root causes of the conflict. That's asking too much of a mission that's coming from the outside into a very turbulent local context. So I don't think that we can criticize the UN missions for a lot of things, but that's not one of them.
Exactly. And also on top of that, what goes is that the state in Africa is the source of oppression. And that's the experience people have. So the trust and legitimacy toward a view on the state is also colored by that. Is time up? Time's up. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Are we having a...
Start at 3.
We start at 3. Okay, we have a 15 minutes break here physically and also virtually. So thank you very much, and thank you, Nina.
Thank you.
Right, thanks for everything. We'll start at 3 o'clock, 1500 hours. Abel.
I just want to check if this mic works.
Die mikrofoon is nie aan nie. Daar is hy.
Ek op oomblik ek wil die ene afsit.
Toets 1, 2, 3.
En ek kom weer na die user, ja.
Kan ons hom, sal hy, tel hy kringgeluid op? Hy is reg, ja.
Hy kom nie so deur, ja. So die mense wat nou by die huis...
By die huis sit, dan tel hy die kringgeluid op.
Jy gaan net, okay.
Op dieselfde manier, ja.
Kry jy die mikrofoon fit in die sinkronisasie?
Jy behoort my nou daar te hoor.
Heavy support packages. It's several levels. Under, for instance, you have
Die feit dat jy op wifi is, en jy soveel ander is wat ook op wifi is, maak dat jy daai selected lyk. So moet ek nie vir jou 'n netwerkkabel sit dat jy op netwerk is in plaas van wifi.
Ek kan maar voorlopig so, dan kan jy dit doen. Jy kan maar 'n kabel insit, dan ons kan maar aangaan.
Ons moet van die ouens vra net van hulle wifi.
Hulle gaan dit doen. Right, if we can continue. The next speaker we have is Professor Abel Esterhazy. He is the chair of the Strategic Studies Department, Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University. You can have a look at his bio, and he'll be speaking on Cabo Delgado and regional responses and the international response that we are seeing playing out there at the moment, and probably the latest case being scrutinized about the topic of intervention. Abel, thank you.
Thank you so much, Francois. Yeah, I'm sort of almost reluctant to talk about this particular topic. Francois, am I? Yeah, I can just open it here. Because so much is being said in the last couple of months about international involvement in Cabo Delgado and what is unfolding in Mozambique, that there's actually a danger that you may get lost in all the noise that you are hearing about Cabo Delgado and the international response to that. I want to start off with two almost generic points about what is unfolding at present. And the first is that whether you're looking at an insurgency in Cabo Delgado or civil wars in Africa, it always sort of starts off with some form of an grievance. And you very often don't solve the problem until you have addressed the grievance in some way or another. And I think it's a very generic thing to say, but it's important that we reflect on that. But the second point I want to make is that in most insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, most civil wars, there's always a foreign contingent and a foreign dimension, and foreign actors involved, supporting both sides of the struggle. And what is worrying me about the situation in Cabo Delgado in the moment, and I'm very cautious to say this once again. I don't know whether you have seen this little video. Let me try and play this. Will it play? Yeah. Why am I playing this little video? It's so reflective for me at the moment of what is going on in Cabo Delgado. There's an agreement on the broader strategic problem. Everybody can see that the river is a problem. And there's strategic clarity, I want to say, on the drivers of the problem in Cabo Delgado, and we can have a bit of a discussion and agreement of some of the drivers. But in essence, there's a good understanding in the international community and locally about the drivers of the problem in Cabo Delgado. But I'm concerned and I'm worried about the operational ambiguity that we are seeing, and I'm not so sure that people have a good understanding of what is unfolding at the operational domain and at the operational level in Cabo Delgado at the moment. And it was interesting for me in the last 2 weeks, I had the opportunity to speak to military people, I had the opportunity to speak to diplomats. And if you speak to them, they're full of confidence. They know precisely what is going on there. Last night, I spoke to 2 people working in the green security environment and that have been in and out of the northern Mozambique area for the last 2 weeks. And they basically said to me, nobody has a clear idea of precisely what is going on inside that problem and inside that province. And they ascribe it to a number of key issues. Firstly, the displaced nature of the population in the province. It's simply difficult to establish a human capability in that area at the moment. There's the issue of the lack of general media coverage of the area. There's simply no media footprint in the area. And then, of course, if you look at the military that's deployed in the area, you're sitting with a force to space ratio that is simply doesn't allow you to develop a blanket coverage intelligence capability to develop a real understanding of what is going on. And that is sort of tied into the regional or the geographical realities. So I want to turn to the Donald Rumsfeld idea of the knowns and the unknowns of the situation in Mozambique. There's broad knowns. We know that the problem is complex, that we're facing a complex emergency. We know that it is still sort of in the developing phase, and probably if we don't do something about it now, it'll probably be too late and it will become a huge problem. And of course, we know that we're probably going to look at complex solutions that will be required over a long period of time. But what we don't know is precisely what the operational situation is on the ground, what is the end state that is required, the processes we need to follow to actually achieve that end state. And then very importantly, something for me, I don't think there's clarity on precisely what the contributions should be of regional and international role players in dealing with the problem in Cabo Delgado. That being said, and now I'm once again fairly generic, I think it is important for us to reflect on what the international community can do. And I've just tried my hand, so to speak, in what I think the international community can and should be doing in Cabo Delgado and in the northern part of Mozambique in addressing the problem. And of course, the first reality of what they need to do and first requirement is to establish some form of security for the population and for the population to return. But then a whole range of things that they can assist with and that we should do that is not in the military domain. To look at restoring the legitimacy of the Mozambican government, good governance, a legitimate economic and political, address the economic and political grievances, intelligence network that I spoke about, and of course then dealing with the broader issues in the Mozambican governance sector, of which corruption is probably the most critical one. Right, so let's turn to what we have seen in terms of international reaction to the problem in Cabo Delgado, and what I think have up until now been key drivers in the international reaction to the problem. Now, first critical question for me that we have seen was the issue of sovereignty. And sovereignty, firstly, sensitivity on the side of the Mozambican government, but also sovereignty because of issues of control. Who's going to keep control and maintain control over what is to be done in Cabo Delgado? Of course, then if you talk about international involvement, the issue of the terms of involvement for foreign role players, what are the pros and cons that they're coming to the table. Of course, there's the question of internationalization of the problem. For Mozambique to say it's not a local problem anymore, the problem is now actually an international problem, and I think the Americans would like to say it's now part of the global war on terror, so to speak. And then, of course, in the region, it was a question of the spillover effect and what the spillover effect may be. Tanzania in the north, South Africa in particular, I know in the last week or two we've seen quite a number of issues concerning the question of spillover effect. I think in Durban in particular, we've seen quite a number of discussions on what the spillover effect may be. But I think that's an important consideration. And then, of course, the issue of the sources of the conflict. Is it an inside-out or an outside-in driven problem? Are the roots of the problem inside Cabo Delgado, or is it an emergency that has been created from outside, so to speak, a fire that has been blown on from outside? And then, of course, the questions of international legitimacy and recognition, and specifically from the side of the from the United States. That being said, I think it is possible for us to demarcate international involvement and responses. Four categories, I would say. Firstly, we have seen the involvement of private military companies in the area. There was Eric Prince's group, Americans, and then the Russians, the Wagners. They were at the receiving end, I think, of some difficult action in Cabo Delgado. They pulled out. Then the South Africans move in. For me, what was interesting there, of course, was how the private military companies was sort of, it was seen as a sort of a both government solution and the solution of Total and some of the commercial companies in the area. Both entities sort of relying on private security initially to deal with the problem in the area. The government bringing in Wagner, the Total and the companies bringing in the South Africans. But there was it was interesting that initially there was a sort of a collaboration almost, government and the commercial entities in the area. But for me, what is interesting eventually is the record of the private military companies in leaving Mozambique. Because on the one hand, you had a report coming out saying, well, you have human rights abuses and all kinds of problems associated with the private security companies and their employment in the area. But at the same time, we've seen reports of, I almost want to say, heroic actions from the private military companies in rescuing people and getting people out of the province. So that was quite an interesting sort of dichotomy almost of the track record of the private military companies. Then, of course, the region and countries in the region, it's quite interesting to see the emphasis on the process of involvement, how they want to do this in a very processed manner and follow the bureaucratic protocols in getting it right. But yeah, I think eventually decisions were also to a large extent driven by questions about capability and interoperability between, I mean, we've been struggling with the African rapid deployment brigades for some time now to get them up and running. And I think the same issues were at play here in terms of interoperability and capability and whether they have the capacity to actually intervene. And to some extent, I'm not sure that the roles that they are to fulfill and what they ought to do in Cabo Delgado has been sorted. I'm not sure myself whether they are deployed to actually support the military of the Mozambican military forces or whether they are in on their own to conduct a counterinsurgency campaign. I think there's quite questions hanging in the air about precisely what it is that they are to do in that area. And then, of course, the important thing about the SADC deployment, especially from a South African perspective, was the maritime component, that for the first time we would be able to actually use our Navy to deal with the problems of the inflow and outflow of the problem that we have in Cabo Delgado. And I think that's important. Important component of the SADC deployment. Two issues, of course, there's always the budgets and the money that's questions that's being questioned and raised questions. Who's going to foot the bill? And I think from the beginning, questions were being asked, especially from a South African side, about who's going to foot the bill. And I think there was an expectation from the beginning that the international community will at least provide some assistance in footing the bill. And I don't think there's clarity on this as yet. I haven't seen anything in this regard that provide any clear guidance and clarity on the issue of footing the bill. And then, of course, the time issue. For how long is the SADC deployment to be? We've seen the last 2 weeks, I think they have extended the deployment for another 3 months. I don't think they have been fully deployed as yet, and they're already extending the deployment. So I think my sort of takeaway from this is that there's a recognition in SADC that it's probably going to be some time. The support from outside Africa has been mostly coming from the West, I should say, mostly in terms of training, military training. But I would assume that there's also, and I assume you're going to talk about it, some development and humanitarian assistance. And I'm also assuming that they will assist in providing some intelligence and cooperating with the Mozambicans in setting up an intelligence network in the area. And then, of course, the black swan outside card that we have seen, the Rwandans. It was quite interesting to see that the initial talks about Rwanda's involvement took place in Paris. They actually flew to Paris to talk about the Rwandan involvement, and that in itself is telling you something about perhaps whose interests are at stake here. We're sitting with Total on the one hand, the discussions about Rwanda's involvement in Paris. But there's also, of course, personal relationships here between the presidents that's been at play. For me, the Rwandan involvement is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, it's obviously shaped by a very aggressive militarized approach to dealing with the problem in Cabo Delgado. That's the first issue. And the second issue is the fact that I think it was the end of September that Kagame visited the troops on the ground, and then already he was talking about pulling them out, and he was basically making the point, you're not going to stay here indefinitely. So they went in to make a difference, to deal with the problem and to pull out. So I don't think this is going to be a long-term deployment. I want to see how this unfolds over time. But it seems to me as if this is a go in, hit hard and get out type of deployment. Yeah. So that's the deployment itself. I want to talk a little bit about, and I think we need to talk about the Western responses here, the outside of Africa response. I almost want to say that is, I think, shaped to a large extent by what happened in Afghanistan and also what we're seeing now in Mali, the French, Europeans pulling out of Mali. They're scaling down that mission. And it's clear from what you are seeing in the discussions and in what is being written about the Western responses to the problem that this is really an approach that focuses on a very light footprint in Africa, in Mozambique, probably intelligence-driven technology rather than people. The preference, if you talk about the American involvement, probably for air power and the use of drones, and also the assistance with resources, whether that is humanitarian, military, or lethal and kinetic type of resources. But it seems to me as if the Western involvement to a large extent are shaped by questions about whether there will be reform within the military system in Mozambique, whether they will be able to assist Mozambique to reform its military, and then also questions about how, especially in the terms of the operational side of things and the kinetic side of things, how the European assistance and weaponry in particular will be utilized in Mozambique. So those are the two critical things I think that is shaping the Western response at the moment. I want to turn to a slide that I've used previously in talking about the complexity of what we are seeing in Cabo Delgado. And for me, the complexity, and I'm specifically talking now from a military perspective, the complexity of the problem is rooted in three key realities. The first complexity is, of course, the diversity of the response to what is unfolding in Cabo Delgado. Diverse in terms of military diverse and humanitarian diverse, but also diverse in terms of the role players that are coming to the table. We're already sitting with Rwanda and the SADC forces. We probably, the Mozambique forces themselves now being trained by a contingent from the West Americans, the Portuguese. So there's a complexity in terms of and a diversity in terms of the capacity to respond to the problem militarily. Of course, there's the complexity of the emergency themselves, and then there's the complexity of COIN and the complexity of a comprehensive approach. The West would like to say, hey, they talk about insurgency and counterinsurgency in terms of the comprehensiveness thereof, and the comprehensiveness giving us an idea of the complexity thereof. But if you bring these three categories of complexity to the table, you really developed an understanding of the challenge from a military perspective that we are facing in Cabo Delgado. And I have to say, I don't want to be the task force commander of the SADC force or any other force that deploys into that area, just from a military perspective, to deal with these sort of three key complexities. That's going to be a real challenge. From a development and a humanitarian perspective, of course, we've already seen questions being asked about the corruption in the system, both in the military and in the broader bureaucracy. We've seen the international community moaning and groaning about visas and custom regulations getting into the country itself. And then who's going to do the coordination, and how is it to be done? Are we going to see the international responses working directly and rolling it out directly in the province and developing a footprint on the ground, so to speak, or are they going to work through the Mozambican bureaucracy? There's quite a debate about that. Yeah, so let me draw some conclusions. In general, I think seems to be a preference for a African solution to the problem. Hopefully the Mozambicans will play an important role in that solutions, but SADC definitely will play an important role in that solutions. The non-African responses up until now have been small scale, they've been under the radar in the form of assistance, in the form of training, intelligence support. And I think in particularly the case of the Western responses, but also SADC, I think there's great caution, and it's done in a way that they don't want to make a difficult situation even more difficult. They don't want to worsen the situation, and so caution is sort of a key driver if you talk about international responses. The issue of how it should be dealt with, I think, is still hanging in the air. For me, it's a case of, do they want to contain the problem, or are they really in it to defeat the insurgency? I don't see that debate as yet. And then, of course, a major problem and a major question and a major debate that we still need to see in the literature and that I haven't seen as yet is the balance between the security military, I almost want to say the kinetic response to the problem, versus the soft, comprehensive humanitarian responses, that's good governance responses, I almost want to say, that will be required to deal with the problems that created the emergency in the beginning. Yeah, so that in broad, a couple of ideas, I think, for us to discuss the issue.
Right. Thank you, Abel, for sharing those thoughts with us. Like they say on the news, this is an ongoing story and probably will be kept up to date in various ways. The next speaker, Professor Tim Muriti from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. He'll speak about continental and regional responses to hybrid threats in Africa. Tim?
Thank you.
You can,
Sure. So
you know where to go.
Yeah. It's down here somewhere. There you go.
Got it.
Yep.
Did you share?
Oh, forgot to share. Sharing is caring. Can you use this?
Okay, I saw such a drive and that's a bit funny. And like I just said now, with this new geo thing with the postcodes, really, I put in a new postcode every 3 times in an hour about. For everything I must put in a new one.
Somebody's patched in.
Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Okay. Thank you and good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Francois Thomas, for technically our co-partners in organizing this event. I'm with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. We are the silent partners, very much Francois' brainchild. And I commend Francois for driving it and also for biting the bullet, shall we say, grabbing the bull by the horns, any number of cliches you can think of, bringing us out physically in COVID to actually meet each other. It's good to see people in person. After 20 months of lockdown, I think it's been quite a long ride. Let's hope there will be no more waves. So the IGR works on the softer side of security, let's say peace building. In terms of managing threats, currently we are working in Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Burundi, Zimbabwe, and we also engage African Union, SADC, and IGAD. But we're based in Cape Town, so we work on a partnership basis. So we don't really have offices out there. We're working with local actors to strengthen their ability to intervene. So I'll speak to continental and regional responses to hybrid threats. I think these PowerPoints will be circulated. So don't worry if I skip some slides. I think it's just, I'm going to try to move quickly. It's about 15 minutes. 20, brilliant. So that's 4 o'clock. In terms of the summary, I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint on the other side, on the virtual side of things. Yeah. Regional dimensions, the spillover effect, the transboundary dimension of the conflicts we've been listening to today. There are a number of conceptual issues. What do we understand by hybrid threats, and the regional conflict systems that spawn them? We can have a discussion around the formation of states. We keep saying the state is the ultimate guarantor of security. But what if there was actually a problem in the formation of the states, or the fact that states themselves are not functional entities? What happens then? Regional responses, in terms of deepening peace building and governance processes, we need to look at least 3 pillars: leader to leader, government to government, people to people interventions. We have so many case studies that we can look at. I mean, Cabo Delgado, Abel's presentation is one that's very current. We can look at the Tigray crisis of Ethiopia, which is now literally firing up at national, regional levels, drawing in Eritrea, Sudan, issues of gender-based violence, food insecurity, so on and so forth. Great Lakes region has been one that's been long running. We heard about MONUSCO. Horn of Africa, also long-standing Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram in the West, this ISIS affiliation, and South Sudan, I think, remains a key challenge. number of other conflicts there that we can mention. There are forgotten conflicts, the Cabinda crisis in Angola, Caprivi Strip, Namibia, Casamance in Senegal. Let me just work out the tech. We need to kind of contextualize continental and regional responses. How do we begin to operate across borders to really secure the regions? I think that's the challenge. AU infrastructure for regional responses. We talk about it a lot. We criticize it a lot. We are frustrated by it. Ultimately, we still need to strengthen it. It's really the only way to go forward. We've seen this long-standing UN missions that can pull out at the moment's notice and leave the situation literally as it was. I think we were discussing this afternoon the Afghanistan case study, 20 years, between $1 and $2 trillion, back to square one. Nothing changed. That, I think Abel and I could have used that 2 trillion to do something useful in terms of in terms of research. I don't know, I'll give you the full amount though, Abel. So we need to be we just need to start interrogating. What's really going to change? What do we need to do to change? Regional integration, crucial. There are obvious constraints and limitations. AU is nowhere near where it should be operating. Neither is SADC, neither is IGAD. None of our institutions actually at the level where they should be doing what they need to be doing, but we just still need to engage with them. The hybrid multiple threat spectrum, I'm not going to spend too much time here. Regionalization of state-armed militia conflict, cross-border incursions, bases in neighboring countries, right? How do you even begin to figure out how you're going to manage this? Because that's a never-ending conflict. Or what Joe Biden called Afghanistan, the forever war. The forever war. It sounds like an Avengers movie. Take Central African Republic, regional configuration. Tigray, we just mentioned, regional configuration. Violent extremism, now you add even more fuel to the fire. Ideological conflict. Politicization of religious ideology to spread terror. Somalia, Cabo Delgado, so on and so forth. Transnational dimension, the Pandora's Papers reveals how money is being fleeced at an industrial scale, because these guys cannot be earning these amounts from just presidential salaries, right? So we've got this whole transnational, international, global infrastructure that allows pipelines for international, transnational crime, cyber warfare, human trafficking, illicit trade. What is the state in the face of this? Single units, the 55 units that we have in Africa, I don't think can really withstand the level of penetration that we're seeing. Contested regime transitions, incumbents always wanting to fudge the electoral outcome, stay in power, tweak the constitution. I think South Africa was on course for that. We dodged a bullet. Tunisia is experiencing that right now. At a local level, intercommunal rivalry. How do you even begin to contain this? Massive amounts of weapons floating across the country, the continent. Socioeconomic unrest, ethnic tension, xenophobia, legacy of socioeconomic deprivation. South Africa in July. We were like, what's going on? And how far is this going to go? How can it be contained? There was a military response, a security response, shall we say. But we haven't begun to scratch the surface on what needs to be done to actually address the socio-economic dimension and actually contain that from emerging. Infectious diseases, we're all sitting around wearing masks. COVID-19, Ebola, a number of African countries have experienced this. These are amplifiers of the threat spectrum. Cross-cutting issues, gender discrimination, youth exclusion, inequality, the environment, climate change, illicit financial flows. The full matrix is really, it's a little bit mind-boggling, but there's a case for increased regionalism, right? I think that's where we need to move. I think just focusing on the state entity by itself and saying that's where the problem lies is missing the mark entirely. More than half of the violent conflicts in Africa can be linked to neighboring states, even more, perhaps, maybe all. Conflicts do not stop at the border, they spill over. And they have cascading and ripple effects, right? We've just named a number of them. So we're really dealing with regional conflict systems. And we don't have very good examples of how conflicts in Africa have been addressed at a regional level, not just a state level, a regional level, right? So that's kind of new thinking. We need to start pushing our policymakers also in that direction. So a lot of them are coming in with state-based attempts to solve problems at the level of the state. And I think that's missing the mark significantly. We've got the case studies. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just the most recent one we're dealing with, the November 2020 outbreak of Tigray, the crisis in the Ethiopian government saying this is policing action, nothing to look at here, folks, move on. Please, this is an internal matter. Please just don't interfere. Attempts to suppress the Tigray regional government, resurgence of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which has a very long history of fighting, goes way back to pre-Meles 93, the fought against Mengistu. So these are highly capable military actors. They are not a Johnny-come-lately outfit. Conflict has spread to Afar, Amhara, Oromo regions. Eritrea has been sucked into the equation, committing atrocities in Ethiopia. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch reported this. Spillover refugees to Sudan. Sudan has an interest. There's already the Nile River Basin issue, which Sudan is contesting with Ethiopia, Egypt. This is a conflagration that potentially could actually explode. Ethiopian government using food insecurity, weaponizing food delivery. World Food Program trucks stuck, can't get into the region to feed the people. Gender-based violence. It's the threat spectrum is just really massive, and leaving it to the country to try to sort this out is problematic. Yes, you've got a problem when government says this doesn't concern you. This is our internal issue. As of yesterday, airstrikes in the Tigray capital, Mekele, ostensibly drones which were purchased from Turkey. You remember Abiy's trip to Turkey? I was like, what is Abiy doing in Turkey? Got a number of drones. And also the government is actually denying that it's striking the region. I'm like, okay, come on. You know, maybe we need drones to take photographs of those drones so that we could have a bit of evidence. So basically the point is it's regionalized. And it doesn't make any sense to talk about a national approach. The policymakers will, the decision makers will keep saying that. And I think we've got to start pushing the envelope a little bit. I mean, that's why we're here, right? Same thing in the Great Lakes. I'm not going to go too far into this one. This is much more well known. UN Force Intervention Brigade. Somali conflict from 91, same issue. And triggered the Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya to 2013, 2015, 2019. You can see a pattern. And now you've got the Kenyan government having a standoff with the Somalis about a colonial border because potentially there's oil there. Now, where's this going to lead to? I see the International Criminal Court justice ruling. South Sudan, 2013 crisis already referenced, and the limits of, actors intervening there. So we need to start thinking slightly outside the box and looking at soft approaches, the primacy of politics, people-centered. You've heard all the buzzwords, but focusing more on regional reconciliation as an approach forward. From the security sector, military intelligence already operate at a regional approach, but this is very much state-to-state relationships, right? African Standby Force, our beloved African Standby Force, is on standby mode. The button is just flicking on standby. So somebody needs to press that button. Mozambique operation, maybe that could, well, SADC was a bit late in the day in coming to the party and only happened when Kagame went in with the Rwandans. So regional coordination is a necessity. It's not a luxury. It really is not a luxury. It's not even like a nice to have. I think it really is a necessity. It's happening at the security level. We need to have it at the reconciliation, peace building reconciliation level. What does that look like in practice? I'm going to skip through some of the slides. That's a lot of content. Reconciliation, very elusive, but this is the glue that you need to enable the exit strategy that I asked Thomas about earlier. What is the exit strategy? To what extent is it being implemented? And I think Thomas may have ducked the question. So I'm gonna answer my own question, which I put to him. Reconciliation is really about dealing with those deep divisions, and they're not only political, civic, they're also socio-economic, they're psychosocial, there's trauma, multiple levels of trauma, and you have to dig in and deal with it. It's not easy stuff though. Everybody wants to sweep it under the carpet. Even here, like every single one of us have one or two traumatic events we've had in the past. We've probably swept it under the carpet. We hope it's going to go away. But every so often it bubbles to the surface and it actually triggers us again. Right. So this is what we're really dealing with. And the principles of reconciliation, truth, recovery, justice, reparation, restoring human dignity, rebuilding human relationships. That's the arduous stuff that we need to be doing. When the peacekeeping mission goes in, when the peace support operation mission goes in, that's where you actually need to start working towards getting an exit strategy. If you really want to be able to pull out, in Darfur, we haven't addressed the issue. And there's a very much forward-looking processes. They happen at an interpersonal, communal, national, and now we can start talking about regional or transnational levels of intervention. These are known as transitional justice processes. But then beyond that, what does regional reconciliation look like? And some of the key elements of this regional reconciliation recognizes these nation states are interdependent, right? There needs to be elements of democracy, and so you need to have dialogue processes that will create the basis for redress, right? Regional reconciliation is a basis for deepening regional integration, and we keep hearing all the policy documents, Pan-African continental integration, African free trade area, single air transport market, African Union passport. There's a shift in that direction. We just need to be much more we have need to push it along from our analysis, from our policy engagement, from our research and teaching. The three pillars I mentioned: leader to leader engagement, dialogue, problem solving, but across borders. So the Ethiopian issue is Eritrea, Sudan, maybe Kenya, everyone's sitting together at that level of the president all the way down, government, and all the way down to the people, because that's who's involved now. I'm not going to talk about that. So do we need to create formal regional reconciliation processes and mechanisms? There are already a lot of informal processes happening across borders, like within the Ugandan conflict system, the Karamoja cluster. Do we need Great Lakes Regional Reconciliation Commissions, or is AU, SADC, IGAD, ECOWAS, ICGLR, East African Community, COMESA, are those the frameworks we need to use? Is it African Union Peace and Security Council, APSA, the institutions that exist, just orienting their focus rather than creating something new? I'm more inclined to orient the focus than to create something new, because that doesn't actually get us very far. So we do need an infrastructure. Civil society actors are already working across borders. We need to take that into account. There will be a lot of thinking that will be required. There are major constraints and limitations because we live in a world of sovereign states, principle of non-interference, territorial integrity, but these are really outdated, outmoded concepts. We need to challenge them, and we need a Pan-African policy coherence that actually will help us to address this elusive dimension of peace and security. Across borders, type of interventions are uncharted territory for many governments and intergovernmental organizations. There is an absence of shared thinking. That's what we're here to do. So African governments need to adopt this as part of their national policies and their foreign policies. In February 2019, the African Union adopted a African Union Transitional Justice Policy adopted by heads of state, which really provides a framework for these sorts of soft interventions and even talks about transboundary engagement. As with all policies, it is gathering dust. It's been 2 years. It's gathering dust in cyberspace. It's on the web. It's on the website of the AU. But we're not really engaging with it, and we need to engage with it much more. I encourage you to use it in your reference, in your work, when you talk about the soft dimensions. And I think this is really what we need to begin addressing, the hybrid threats that exist on the continent going forward. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Right. Orwell and Tim, thank you very much for sharing this with us. I'm trying to follow on another platform. I saw there were some discussions, especially on Cabo Delgado. I did not pick up questions. So would there be any questions from the floor for either of the two speakers before we move on to the next, to Professor Solomon? Okay. I'm going to try the mic again.
Okay, super, thanks. So first of all, for Prof. Esterhazy, for Abel, thank you very much for your presentation. Just a very specific question. During the attacks on Palma, it's said that the DAG helicopters had to fly almost 45 minutes to Pemba to refuel because Total wouldn't let them land on the Afungi Peninsula, which would have been a 3-minute ride because they didn't want to get involved and appeared to be partisan. I just wondered about some reflections on that, if you have any, because during the time that it took to fly those sorties, invaluable time was lost. And I've heard all sorts of strange stories in relation to who was extracted. So perhaps something about that. And then secondly, if I may, for Prof. Moriti, for Tim, thank you for that as well. What's the space like post the failure of the responsibility to protect in an African context post Libya? And how would you think creatively about space for a solidaristic response that doesn't undermine sovereignty? Thanks.
It's an interesting question about. It's an interesting question, and of course, I mean, I've read and I've listened to the same information. For me, I think from a principled perspective, the question here is one of private military companies and their rules of engagement, and it actually highlights the difficulty of private military companies in these kind of conflicts. But let me say, I don't think what we are seeing, what we have witnessed, will be limited to private military companies in Mozambique. And I think this is precisely why I spoke about the interoperability factor. If you start deploying multiple forces into the area and you start working with multiple entities in the area with different memorandums of understanding, different rules of engagement, then you're getting that kind of problems. And I think if you talk to people from the Afghanistan perspective, you'll probably pick up the same kind of dichotomies in the deployment of military forces in that particular area as well. So, on the one hand, it's a very generic answer and it's a very generic problem. On the other hand, we're probably going to see more of it in Mozambique if we have more a more divergent type of entities deploying into the area. Rwanda, SADC, and who else will be throwing their forces into the area. So I think it's typical.
Thank you, Alain. So R2P, post-Libya, and solidaristic approach responses to crisis. So I think R2P took a big hit when George Bush used the phrase to justify invading, in fact, Libya. Ultimately, NATO troops were involved, and they summarily took out Muammar Gaddafi in a very unceremonious way. Some would say he deserved it. I will leave that to his creator to decide. So R2P, unfortunately, particularly amongst African countries and many countries in the global south, has got a bad rep right now. It's got a bad reputation. Very difficult to invoke it, even when it's invoked within the UN. African countries, African governments actually tell you, no, we're not going to go down that route because it means that you pretty much want just to have a, droit de noblesse to intervene whenever you feel like you want to intervene. And it got corrupted. It's actually a noble concept. Kofi Annan, Mohamed Sakhnoun, Gareth Evans, excellent report, very timely, very necessary. But unfortunately, I think that the ship may have sailed. We can be creative about how we can bring it back as a novel concept, but I think at the moment it's in a bad space. So in terms of solidaristic approach responses that don't undermine sovereignty, I think we have to start with what is the function of sovereignty. It is, yes, to protect the territory and to ensure that the people can live to their best of their ability. But when, as Thomas in fact said, that the states, particularly in Africa, are part of the problem, not part of the solution. They are the primary actors in oppression, suppression, violence, terrorism even, state terrorism. Then we need to think slightly outside the box. And in a globalized and a regionalized world, the solidaristic approaches to solving problems is actually to constrain the power of states to continue with this oppression. And therefore it requires pooling resources to the larger regional economic communities, to the continental entity. Dysfunctional as it is, and as they are still the pathways to constraining the effects of the state. When the United Nations has lost its legitimacy and credibility to be on the continent and has to operate in concert with the AU almost always, or regional actors, then we need to make sure that our regional institutions actually function better. And that's our collective responsibility. It's got to do with no one else. It really is us as citizens of this continent. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Tim, can I just make a remark? What is quite interesting for me is to see how the big and major powers is returning to Africa, but they're returning to Africa in a way that they are actually making use of front organization. And you see that front organizations. You see it in Turkey, you see it in Russia. The Wagner Group have now become the face of Russia in Africa. And that's a worrisome sort of development for me from a military perspective in Africa.
Thank you, Albert. We really have to move on. Sorry, I have to be brutal.
There will be a wine and cheese.
Right, our next speaker is Professor Hussein Solomon. Hussein, you don't have a PowerPoint. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm just
I'm trying to find you on here. This one.
Okay, Hussein, the screen on this side doesn't pick you up, but that's fine. You can continue, please. We listen to you. At the end of your speech, we can't take any more questions. We're pushing up against time. People who have questions, I want to suggest you buy the book. The particulars are at the end of the program. You can have a look and purchase the book from the program and the link there. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you very much, Professor Frey. I just want to maybe start. So there was the 20 years anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks. And am I coming across okay on your end, in terms of audio at least?
Audio is good, thank you.
Okay, so you essentially had 90% of all academic studies which were published after the Twin Towers and the attack on the Pentagon after 2001. And this, of course, raises an interesting question. What's the purpose of a new book when a book on terrorism is produced every 6 hours, literally since 9/11? And I think that one of the issues which we need to state up front is that the Global Terrorism Database has recorded over 170,000 terrorist incidents between 1970 to 2019. So the academic studies hasn't really had any impact in terms of what's happening on the ground. And one of the things that we try to change in terms of this book is to bring together academic insights and insights of policymakers. So you had academics, and you had military officers, and you had conservationist specialists, all sharing the pages of this particular volume. I think that there are two caveats which is quite essential when we are taking stock of the existing scholarship. I mean, Paul Wilkinson reminds us that the notion of an unbiased scholarship is impossible to achieve, that those producing scholarship on terrorism are products of their social and economic milieu, and they represent the political culture, the national interest in their countries of origin. So I think recognizing this truism, we have sought to combine different scholars from different faith traditions, different races, different countries, different cultures, championing different theoretical traditions. I also think that if you look at Richard English's superb analysis on the future study of terrorism, he actually points out that the majority of the scholarship is not being produced by scholars who are residing in the country or region they are writing about. And so what we try to do here is to actually focus in using authors who live in that particular region and so forth to have a better perspective of things. The other thing is that we're not focusing on any singular terror group. So, you know, you have the Taliban, you have Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the various local franchises, and so forth, a number of different groups, so we can sort of get comparative insights, general conclusions on the modus operandi of terrorist groups, from issues of radicalization and recruitment to terrorist financing and so forth. And then very importantly, in terms of regional, you know, there's been various studies focusing either on a particular country or on a particular region. And when you look at globalization, we live in an interconnected world, okay? And where insecurity anywhere threatens security everywhere. So one little example of this, of course, is the case of Islamic State, which lost their de facto capital, Raqqa, on the 17th of October 2017. This defeat saw them spread their tentacles into other regions. And as a result, the 2020 Global Terrorism Index noted that whilst the security situation in the Middle East actually improved, with terrorist deaths having declined by 87% between 2016 and 2019, Islamic State was responsible for over 3,000 attacks in almost 50 countries over the same period. So, and I mean, if you just look at another example of this interconnectedness, would be Kurt Steiner's chapter in this volume about how terrorist groups in Africa have globalized their funding sources through environmental crime. Okay, and then if you examine this interconnectedness through two other chapters, I would say Anatosh, for example, looks at the flow of migrants between or from the Middle East and Africa into Europe and the implication this holds for terrorism, whilst Olivier Kasky and Tom Smith demonstrate how European females are recruited into Middle Eastern terror groups. So it's actually quite important to understand these global connections and so forth. The other thing is that there are various studies focusing on the issue of terrorism thematically, right? So you had Piscio and Hain looking at it theoretically, Martin Boucher looking at the interface between social networks, and other people looking at it legislatively. Groman, for example, focusing just on counterinsurgency. But all of these studies provide useful snapshots of the phenomenon. And what we were trying to do with this particular study is to capture the motion picture of terrorism from origins and formation to growth and execution of terror attacks, you know, and I think that gives you a sort of more holistic approach. So this volume has Bianca Nudia focusing on the theoretical challenges, Alter Hobler focusing on the use of social media by terrorist groups, Eben Barlow focusing on the military dimension of counterterrorism, and complementing him, you have Annelie Botha, who explores the interface between peacekeeping and countering violent extremism. Arno Tosh, meanwhile, looks at how social attitudes are driving terrorism. Okay, and let me just dwell a little bit in terms of the theoretical dimension. So this book brings together your orthodox terrorism studies, if I can call that, infused with realism. Then you have your critical terrorism studies, and then you have those who approach security from a more constructivist lens, you know, looking at the historical processes of structural violence and the role of the state in producing terrorism, and these particular dimensions. And I think it is quite important. And whilst there is a tension between these different approaches, we actually need all of these different insights. And if you look at the scholarship of several senior scholars in the world on issues of terrorism, I'm thinking about Paul Wilkinson, I'm thinking about Alex Schmidt, they actually do not neatly fit into a simplistic dichotomy. So sometimes these theoretical divides are artificial, in my view. I also think that there has been new developments which need to be taken into account. And I'm thinking about the Abrahamic or the Abraham Accords, right? For most analysts, the Arab-Israeli conflict was now taken as a ubiquitous feature of the Middle East geostrategic landscape, but the signatories to the Abraham Accords prove this not to be the case. You know, as Glenn Siegel argues in this volume, there's an evolving new world order stressing common interests and has above all recognized the futility of terrorism as a means to an end. And so I think these are all of the sort of insights that I can maybe say about the use of this book. But I would like to maybe highlight one of the weaknesses of now current scholarship, which was touched on by previous speakers here, which we try to address in this volume, and that is the issue of state terrorism, which has been de-emphasized. You know, recent studies on terrorism has only focused on the violence perpetrated by non-state actors, and this omission did not happen by accident. Governments have funded much terrorism research and, of course, would not like to be the subject of such scrutiny. You know, as Bianca Nudia notes in this volume, it is the state which gets to define who is a terrorist and what types of violence is considered as terrorism. And this omission or de-emphasis is rather surprising, since the phenomenon has its modern origins in the aftermath of the French Revolution, when Robespierre and his minions unleashed state terror against all opponents to the Republic between June 1793 and July 1794. So if the birth of the French Republic gave us fraternity, liberty, and equality, it is also true that it gave us the guillotine, fear, and terror. I mean, examples of now state terrorism goes back all the way to Nero. We can look at the killing of 1 million Armenians by Ottoman Turks, Imperial Japan, Hitler's Third Reich. I mean, the Pol Pot Cambodia, and so forth. And yet there's silence on this, and we really try to address this, because if you take the Sahel region, you know, the citizens are caught between a rock and a hard place, between Islamist militant actors as well as very violent state actors as well. And I think that there have been other blind spots that this manuscript tries to deal with, you know, in terms of the mythical gender stereotypes. You know, Smith and Caskey has noted that scholarship has largely focused on the study of men in jihadist activities. This is despite that women account for as much as 30% of members of terrorist groups worldwide. And to compound matters, they argue that policymakers continue to respond to it as if this was the reality. But women jihadists are not just largely passive jihadi brides. You know, women's roles in terrorist organizations are quite diverse, serving as recruiters, financiers, propaganda disseminators, doctors, and even serving as tax collectors. And I also think that we shouldn't be too negative when dealing with policy prescriptions and so forth, because if you look at the Global Terrorism Index, the number of terrorist index the number of terrorism incidents has actually fallen for each consecutive year between 2015 to 2019. And whilst 35 countries recorded a deterioration in the security situation, 103 countries recorded an improvement. So I do believe that we can actually learn from the successful case studies. I also that there are some blind spots that this book addresses. If I take Tosha's chapter, for example, about the social attitudes driving this phenomenon, utilizing data sets from Pew as well as the Gender Social Norms Index, Tosh concludes that restrictive gender norms are the decisive factor leading to the support of terrorist groups. Okay. And if you look at the work of Anila Salman, you know, it actually reinforces that, where she said that females' actual advancement and equality in education, employment, and political representation are more effective in reducing terrorism. So if we are serious about putting the brakes on the Islamist juggernaut, we will need to promote gender equality across the Muslim world, and such gender equality cannot be embraced without promoting a more liberal Islam. To stress one other point, and that is about the issue about the capacity of the state, which is quite weak. And Ibn Barlow talks about inadequate military doctrine, poor training and leadership within the African theater, and intelligence deficit. And having to go on offensive as terrorists gather momentum. And you have a military doctrine that is unsuited for African conditions, irrelevant training, and poor advice from foreign actors. So the book covers a variety of different issues, new issues as well as old issues. And so to kind of conclude, I want to stress the issue from the Global Terrorism Index, which is emphatic that governance is the most important factor that determines the size, longevity, and success of a terrorist group. And this issue of good governance must be stressed. when we are dealing with issues of counterterrorism. Because of time, I cannot go into more detail, but I hope that all of you would support a struggling third world academic and buy the book. Thank you very much.
Right, finally from our side, Hussein, thank you very much. Immediately, something reached my ears that I also have to take note of. But in general, with regards to this event, a word of appreciation for the in-person body that's here. Thank you for your patience. The virtual attendance, thank you for attending, for registering and bearing with us. This is a bit of an experiment. We learned a few lessons if you want to run this hybrid type of session. Overall, a word of appreciation to the speakers, a word of appreciation to Thomas and the Danish Foreign Office who funded this event and made this possible, that we could bring people together in body and in soul and in intellect. Thank you, Thomas, much appreciated. The recording of this event will go onto the SIGLA site early next week, and it will also be distributed for those who ask for it in a different manner, but it will go onto the SIGLA site. So another one down. Again, a word of appreciation. I'm going to leave and shut down now, and we'll continue on this side by having a bit of a networking function. Go well, whether you go virtually or physically. Thank you very much.